My name is Joni Parsons. I'm founder of Revel 11, and we're so happy that you are all here today. And welcome, Dr. Storoni. So, what if you could harness the diverse gears of your brain for optimal focus, creativity, and productivity, and then align those natural rhythms of the brain to enhance your ability to process information effectively? It sounds pretty good, doesn't it? I'm excited. Um, we're here to talk about the book Being Hyperefficient with Dr. Mithu Storoni. Am I pronouncing that right? We didn't have a chance
That's
to
all right.
talk
It's
before.
Mithu Storoni. That's fine.
Okay, thank you so much. We usually have a chance to talk, but it didn't work today. And her latest book is called Hyperefficient: Optimize Your Brain to Transform the Way You Work. She is a University of Cambridge trained physician and neuroscientist. And she is also the author of Stress Proof: The Ultimate Guide to Living a Stress-Free Life. And she's joining us today from London. Welcome. It's so nice to have you here.
Thank you again so much for having me. It's a pleasure to join you.
Oh. So first of all, what inspired you to write this book called Hyperefficient?
Well, while working with different people in various companies in the corporate world, it really struck me to ask why it is that things like burnout, things like stress, the other issues that we are getting with work, why are all of these cropping up more and more frequently as time goes on? And that made me sort of burrow into looking at, well, you know what? It's not the workers who have the problem. Maybe it's the way we work that's wrong. And then I discovered that actually the way we work is still reminiscent of how we used to work 100 years ago and longer from, the time of the assembly line when we used to we first worked with our hands and then we swiftly moved to working with our minds. But we treated the brain like a muscle. We just forced the brain to work as if it were a pair of hands. And then I realized that as information is becoming more and more, moving around at greater and greater volume, we're having to deal with so much more. Our brains just cannot cope with this anymore. So really, we have to reassess the way we work.
Yes, and we're going to dive into that in a few moments. But how do you define hyper efficiency, and how is that different from other modes of productivity?
So usually we think of efficiency in terms of, or productivity in terms of creating or providing or producing the most quantity of output per unit of time. So how many hours did you put in a day? How many boxes have you ticked? But I think we have now come to a point where because machines are doing a lot of these work types for us, we have to look at, you know what, how many really good ideas did you produce within this set of time? And how many really sellable products did you produce if they are intangible products within this period of time? So we have to start looking at the quality of what we are doing. And when you look at the quality of what you're doing, you have to take a completely different approach. So I call that being hyper efficient, where it's a play on words because it's efficiency, but relating to quality. And you also achieve it in a completely different way.
I find what you've talked about so interesting because our brain has not caught up with, the fast pace that we live in and AI and all of these inputs that we're getting. We're all working at the same way, like you mentioned. So, in this accelerated pace of this world, rather than change the speed at which we work, how do we start to change the patterns of our work? And that's what you're talking about. So, what does that mean?
So that means that what you want to do is you want to create the best environment for your best thoughts to come to hatch, essentially, or to emerge. So, if you are writing for something, if you are creating, if you have a company and you're thinking about innovation, if you're trying to write a business plan, if you're doing all of those things, what you want to do is you want to be in the right mental state so that when you sit down and start to write, the ideas just come and they're not kind of suboptimal that you have to write for 6 hours and then cross off what you've come up with. You want to really get to what you want. And in order to do that, you have to remember that the brain has got many rhythms within it, within its function. So, very, very basically, we all know the rhythm of day and night, right? We all know about circadian rhythms, and we have many more people now. We're becoming aware of how important it is to align that with our physiology. So, for instance, the circadian rhythm itself has got a link with the kind of work you do at any time of day. So it seems that creative work, sort of idea generation, where you're thinking outside the box, you have a problem and you just want to go off and think about it and you want to solve it. That sort of thinking happens very early in the day and very late in the day. Whereas focused attention work, the brain is primed to do that a little bit later, sort of in the mid-morning to lunchtime, mid-afternoon to early evening. And we all seem to have this post-lunch dip to varying degrees. Of course, if you take some coffee, you can avoid it.
Sometimes.
Sometimes,
Yes.
but this tendency to sort of for our attention to dip immediately after lunch is
Right.
pretty ingrained. So we don't really take that into account when we design our meetings. We put meetings in the morning when we are in the mental state of peak focus. We try to do focused work immediately after lunchtime, which backfires. So if you were to really kind of look at your schedule and so far as is possible, mold it to these rhythms, you're much more likely to be in the right mental state for your work.
I think this is so fascinating. So we all have our own biorhythms. And for instance, I'm a morning person. Even from, a very early age, I was up about 4:45, 5. And but how does someone like me, or say a night owl, work to maximize their efficiency, knowing that we have these two completely separate biorhythms and we're trying to, most of the time, fit into an 8-hour workday?
So in an ideal situation, if you were to have some control over your hours, you would fit your workday to suit your own rhythm. So if you are a lark, so if you prefer to wake up or naturally tend to wake up earlier in the day, so your rhythm is shifted towards the morning, then all of these things would just start sooner. So your creative window would happen sooner in the day. And in terms of work, you could, for instance, if you have the flexibility to do so, you can say, okay, you know what? I'm not going to start work at 9. I'm going to begin work at 7, especially if your work involves a creative component. And you can say, I will trade off a few hours in the evening for those few hours in the morning. So that's one way of doing it. And if you are a night owl, you can flip it the other way.
I love being a lark, by the way. So talk about the power of these rhythmic bursts that you talk about, otherwise known as power laws. Can you explain the mode of how this works and how we can incorporate those into our lives?
So there are a couple of things to remember. So first thing is that the brain is not like muscle, so it can't just carry on working with a steady output for a prolonged period of time. It gets tired very quickly. And the more intense, the more difficult your work, the faster it gets tired, the sooner it gets tired. So if you're making really tough decisions, one after the other, one after the other, you're going to get tired much more quickly than if you're doing something lighter, like answering some unimportant emails, for instance. So your brain gets tired. Now, when it gets tired, if you keep pushing it, you will still be able to produce the work, but the quality of your work will not be as great. And you will not be able to do your best quality work. Okay. And you won't be able to do kind of difficult analytical work. So, any decisions you make, if they're very complicated, you're likely to make them suboptimally. You're likely to not just make decisions, but also kind of observe problems in a very narrow angled way. So all of these things happen if you carry on working despite being tired. So we have two options. You can either work in short chunks and then rest. But actually, if you go back to how we used to work naturally, or how we tend to work when a routine work cycle is not imposed on us, we
Mhm.
seem to follow these what I call power law rhythms, which means that we work in a sort of in a kind of a smooth transition where we do tough, really hard work for really short periods of time, medium work for longer, and lighter work for longest. And if you follow this, so it works out as a sort of curve, if you imagine an upside down curve. And so if you
Mhm.
follow these rhythms, these curves, then what happens is if you work in, say, 90-minute sessions, you're looking to do really, really tough, intense work for,
So
say, the
here's
first.
the, let me
That's
see
right.
that.
That's a
Yes.
perfect demonstration. So you're looking to do really tough work for a really short period of time and then quickly transition into lighter work. And what this does is you can keep working without actually stopping working, but at the same time, you don't tip your brain over to fatigue. And so you can actually sustain a long, full, productive day at work if you follow this approach, as opposed to just keep working until you're tired and then take some coffee and then push through even more. If you work in this way, you actually can preserve your peak cognitive ability. And in pre-industrial times, we used to work like this. And even as I described, even people like Charles Darwin, um,
Einstein.
Einstein, all of these people, they used to work in these patterns. They used to write letters in these patterns. So this is one way of creating a good compromise between not overexhausting your mind and hence carrying on producing good work and giving your mind some rest.
And you suggest in your book about 90-minute chunks of time that you work in. And within that time, you have three modes. You have gear 1, 2, and 3. Will you describe those for us and the benefits of each?
So gear 1, 2, if you imagine your brain, and this is a metaphor, we don't actually have physical gears in our heads, as
Right.
far as I know.
This is your metaphor.
This is a metaphor. It's actually based on the locus ceruleus noradrenergic system. So it does have a neurological, neuroscientific substrate to it, but it's much easier just to imagine the brain as an engine that's slicing or munching information. And it works at three powers: 1, 2, and 3. So, 1, you can just imagine it's very slow. So, it's when your mind gently wanders, you sort of sit and daydream, you don't focus, you can't really focus. In gear 3, we'll do 2 last. In
Yeah.
gear 3, you're the opposite. You have very sharp focus, but it jumps from where you're looking at, where you want it to be, to absolutely anything, any distraction around you. So you don't have control over where you put it, it just darts everywhere. Gear 2 is the Goldilocks zone. So in gear 2, you have perfect control over your focus. In fact, it's so good that you can control your focus, but at the same time, let your attention wander whenever necessary. And you know you're in gear 2 simply by being able to assess whether you have control over your attention. And this middle zone, middle gear 2, is really, really important at many different levels. So one level, for instance, is that in this state, the part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which sits at the front of your head, and it's responsible for really making us human, allowing us to do all the things that machines cannot do, and I don't think they ever will be able to do, things like very complex problem solving, complex decision making, planning, all of these things. Your prefrontal cortex is fully engaged in gear 2. And that's why it's the optimal state to be in, no matter what kind of work you're doing. When you're in gear 2 and you're working, as soon as your brain gets tired, you will naturally notice your attention kind of drifts off a little bit. That is your brain naturally trying to gear down back into gear 1 to rest. And that's why the mind starts wandering, your motivation dwindles as soon as you feel a little bit tired. Now, if you push on the pedal and you carry on, or you take 3 espressos, you can overshoot into gear 3. So this is why when you work in gear 2, but take plenty of breaks, work in those slots of 90 minutes. And when you take your break, you downshift into gear 1. So that's the dynamic you want to aim for.
And we'll talk a little bit more about how to take those breaks and what that looks like in just a moment. So, how do we manage these gears during the day? Like, how can we? So, say I was working this morning for an hour and a half. How can I self-evaluate what gear I'm in? I mean, or what would you recommend, or how would you recommend doing that?
So first of all, during the course of an entire day, your gear sort of shifts by itself a little bit. So when you wake up, moments after you've woken up, before you've reached for your coffee, before you've gone for a run, if that's what you do, your brain, your mind is in a gear 1 state, because you'll know this because your mind is very relaxed, very hazy, it's kind of wandering, but you don't feel like you can sit at a computer and just focus on a complex report or something like that. That's the gear 1 state. And then gradually, as the morning draws on, you shift into gear 2. You will know you're in gear 2 because when you sit in front of something, you can hold your focus.
Focus. Okay.
That is how you know you're in gear 2. When you're sitting working, and say you're working on something moderately difficult, and it's 90 minutes have gone by, or 60 to 90 minutes have gone by, and then your attention just starts to wander, something you could focus on so well, now your mind is just drifting, you're thinking about other things. That is a sign that your brain is feeling tired, your mind is feeling tired, you're developing mental fatigue, and you're switching back into gear 1. So that's how you know whether you are in gear 2 or in gear 1. And let's look at the opposite example. If you're sitting in gear 2, you've got your focus, but a very nice colleague next to you has made themselves a triple espresso and brought you one, even though you've just had your triple espresso. So you take 6 shots now of espresso.
And that's a lot.
I'm not recommending anyone does this, but as an example, you were in gear 2 and now you just shoot up to gear 3. And how do you know that? Well, you had excellent focus so far, but now the drilling that you couldn't hear a moment ago suddenly is all you can hear. You can hear the chattering, you can hear people talking, the beeps really throw you off your path. That's a sign you've gone into gear 3. So if you want to maneuver yourself within these 3 things, the first is to try and coordinate with the time of day. And the second is, we already use things like caffeine, we use things like going for a run. So anything that really makes you more alert will shift you upwards. So if you're feeling lethargic, if you're feeling kind of slow thoughts, daydreaming, that sort of state, then anything that makes you feel more alert will shift you up. It's more difficult to shift down once you're in gear 3. And for that, you can use 2 approaches. One approach is to actually tap into your physiology. And again, many people will be accustomed to or familiar with some of these techniques, things like using your breath, having a breathing exercise, doing stretching. And every time you stretch muscle and relax it, the relaxation brings your gear down. The same with contracting muscle. If you contract your muscle and you then release it, that brings your gear down. A very gentle, light exercise also brings your gear down. So these are the physiological ways of doing it. If you're sitting in front of a pile of work and you want to bring your gear down, there are also 3 ways of doing it. One is relating to your workload. So if you're doing many things and you feel yourself in that kind of jittery gear 3 state, immediately try to slice off as many items on your list as possible. Narrow the things you have to focus on. The second is remove, where possible, the perception of time moving quickly. So create an illusion of time moving slowly. And how would you do that? Well, you can do that through sound. Right. You can do that through sound. You can do that through modifying your environment. Um, be somewhere where people are speaking slowly, moving slowly, things are softer, things are lower. So you can do that through those manipulations. And the third is using uncertainty as a modulator. So if if you're sitting down to do work and it's you just can't make yourself write that email or file that report. As soon as you know there's a deadline, somehow the energy just comes to you. So the perception of uncertainty immediately raises your gear. And so reducing uncertainty can help you lower it. So creating some perception of increased control can help you calm your mind and downshift back into gear two.
That's wonderful. And also, you mentioned something else that was really interesting to me is about the movement of our eyes and how that impacts our ability to focus or maybe like, come back into ourselves at a moment. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yes. So if you think about it evolutionarily, we are all, our eyes are connected to our brains and our brains are connected to our bodies. And we always used to be in these extreme states as entire humans. Okay. So it's only when we started working on the assembly line that the mind slept while the body worked. And now most of us sitting on office chairs, our brains work and our bodies sleep. But if you dig deeper, you really find these intriguing connections. So the eyes are one of these things. There is data that when Olympians, when world-class athletes are trying to do something, so whether it's archery, whether it's shooting competitions, or even surgeons, microsurgeons, when they're operating and they really have to be calm and still or their hands will shake, if they focus their gaze to within around about 10 degrees of the target that they are going to act on, or 10 degrees of any target. So even in tennis, this is possible if you focus your gaze on the tennis ball just before you serve or return a serve. If you do that and you really still your eyes, that seems to have a calming influence on the mind, and it can draw you back from a state of gear three nerves back into gear two calm. Now, the eyes always move. It's a phenomenon known as saccades, and that movement is very kind of microscopic. So I'm describing the macroscopic moving in that you're trying to consciously bring your eyes to get to focus in on one narrow target. Right. And, even with meditative techniques, many meditative techniques also involve kind of looking at one thing, focusing on a candle or things like that. So this is quite a well-known phenomenon. And you will know that, when you're anxious, the eyes dart around. So it sort of makes sense that when you want to calm yourself and focus, you narrow your focus because your attention goes where your eyes go.
I love that so much because, of course, in yoga, you have drishti when you're trying to balance, and that singular focus will help you balance your body, whether you're on one leg or two legs. And so I have never thought about this during work, like a work day, to use my eyes to bring me back into center. So thank you for that. I thought that was a really interesting point. And there was also an example in the book about the runner who beat his time by focusing on a singular line and time that was set for him. Can you explain that just really quickly? Because I thought that was a really interesting example.
Well, when you are, if you take a kind of a broad view of it, where you have at any point your brain is processing lots and lots of information, and in a way, it becomes inefficient when you're processing many things at the same time. And wherever your eyes go, wherever your attention goes, you voluntarily accept that bit of information and process it. And that takes away your bandwidth. That takes away some of your bandwidth. So if instead you really narrow in your focus onto whatever it is you are trying to do, then you are in many ways summoning your entire kind of resources from top down, because your brain, of course, controls your body's movements.
Mhm.
Exercise has got a huge cognitive angle to it. And so by doing that, you can actually improve your efficiency and be able to kind of zoom in and accelerate and get to the absolute peak of where you are, of what you can deliver.
I love that so much. Thank you. We'll get to questions in a couple of moments. So, if we're looking at the rhythms of the mind, what does that ideal, we talked a little bit about this, but what does that ideal day look like? Because we want this to be a workshop as much as possible so that people can really take, some tips away from this. So, do the hardest tasks in the first 20 minutes. And this is in that 90-minute time frame. Is that correct? So you just keep repeating this throughout the day?
Correct. So the first thing to ask yourself is, what task am I working on? If you're working on something creative, then actually giving yourself a 90-minute deadline is not going to help you. The reason being, if you're doing something creative, you just have to let it flow when it arrives. And as soon as you become aware that there is a deadline, you shift from gear. So you want to be in between sort of gear 1 and 2, so the very
Mhm.
gentle state of gear 2. But as soon as there's a deadline, you shift upwards. And so you're drawn out of the creative state. So if you're doing something creative, there's no need to give yourself 90-minute blocks, because the whole creative wandering in itself is not actually exhausting as much as focused work. So if you're doing something creative, this doesn't apply. If you're doing something non-creative, regardless of what it is, where you need to focus, then yes, try to divide your day into 90-minute work cycles, ending with, if possible, a 15 to 20-minute break. Now, within the 90-minute cycle, it depends what kind of work you're doing. If your work is intensely fatiguing, then you can actually take mini breaks within that 90-minute cycle. As a quick example, if you look at something like writing or sitting down for exam papers, math exam papers, which are really, really difficult,
Mhm.
there is data that shows that if you take as little as a 5-second break every 2 minutes, your performance actually improves. So but that's a
Wow.
very, very intense form of work. So if you're doing
Mhm.
something very, very intense, then every 20 minutes, you can take a very, very short break of 3 to 10 minutes within the 90-minute cycle. And after 90 minutes are over, take a longer break. Now, within the 90 minutes also, if possible, depending on how much flexibility you have, try to divide the 90 minutes in terms of work, the weight of work, so the kind of intensity of work. So you're
Mhm.
doing the
So
toughest work.
high.
Correct, correct. So that curve. So you're doing the toughest work at the start of those 90 minutes for, if possible, maximum of 20 minutes. Then you shift over to less intense work. Now, most of us have multiple things that we need to be getting on with every day. So you can switch from one really heavy thing to something slightly lighter, and then, if possible, lighter still, and then you end on a break. If you don't have the ability to do that, so if after you've worked very hard for 20 minutes, but you still haven't finished what you were working on, save it for the next 90-minute cycle and do it at the start of the next 90 minutes if possible. So in this way, you're grading things. The other thing to bear in mind is that if you do really, really intense work, and again, the equivalent of writing really tough exam papers or studying or making really tough decisions one after the other, if you do that kind of work, then try to make sure the total time for which you're doing that intensity of work, you can do lower intensity work for the rest of the time, but that intensity of work ideally is not more than 4 hours a day. Because if it is, it carries over to the next day. The fatigue carries over to the next day, even if you sleep overnight. So
Mhm.
that's another thing to bear in mind.
I thought that was really interesting. And you talk about the importance of recharging, and you can do that with, sometimes, I'm lucky enough to work at home now, for the first time in my entire career. And so every once in a while, I'll go take a nap and just even lie down for 10 or 15 minutes. But it's amazing the charge that I have after that I'm rejuvenated and I've given myself a break, or I might go pick some flowers. What else would you suggest that people do in that quick 10 minutes?
So it depends partly on when you're taking that 10 minutes, so when in the day it falls, and the kind of work you're doing. So you mentioned a nap. So the nap is, if possible, it would be amazing and excellent for everyone's brain health as well as performance if everyone were to take a very brief nap immediately after lunchtime. Um, it is the practice in some cultures, in some parts of the world, but sadly, we think if we are sleeping on the job, that's a big no-no. But ideally, if you were to do that, you can actually prolong your cognitive stamina for longer during the day. So the quality of your work actually continues to be excellent for the rest of the
Mhm.
day. If you take a nap, ideally make it early in the afternoon. At other times of the day, if you can take a nap, sure, that would be, that's always very rejuvenating.
That's such a luxury. I mean, most people don't have that ability. So I
It is
was
a
wondering
huge.
other things like just even walking outside for a few minutes, or just changing your situation to have something, different to look at, or new inputs. I think that is also healthy as well.
Absolutely. So if you don't have that luxury, what you want to do during your proper breaks is you want complete and total psychological detachment from what you're doing.
Mhm.
And if you can put yourself in an environment where things are slow, the perception of time slows down and the perception of uncertainty disappears, and your brain is also not having to process any information. So, as you say, green space, something neutral, something slow, anything that's not your workplace where you're not thinking about work, you're not speaking to a colleague, you're not chatting to a colleague in a coffee shop. All of those things are ideally best avoided. You want complete and total psychological detachment. That's the key during a break.
Okay. Thank you. It's so healthy to take those breaks, and I do that regularly, and I'm going to do that even more. So let's take some of the questions here. So, and this is a big question for me because I am quite a multitasker. I've always prided myself on that, and that's not necessarily good. So, what would you recommend about multitasking?
So I'm going to throw a curveball in here and say multitasking is not always bad at all.
Oh,
It
that's good
depends.
to know.
Exactly. So, as an example, my husband is the most incredible multitasker. I cannot do it. And one of the reasons is you need to, I describe in the book this concept of gear personality, and that sort of weaves into it a little bit. So we all need a certain bandwidth of mental load or of stimulation in order to be in the right mental state to be able to focus. And in some ways that's a subjective thing. So what you find stimulating, I might not find stimulating, and vice versa. But by and large, we need to have our own personal optimal level of stimulation to be in the right mental zone. So if you're doing something that perhaps is a little bit dull for you as an individual, then adding something else on the side actually makes your brain push on the pedal and put you back into gear two, which is the optimal state, where you were bored and in gear one without doing multitasking. So, multitasking can really help fix your attention if you happen to be in gear one. Now, if you are someone like me and you have a very low tolerance for multitasking and you're easily in gear two, then multitasking can push you overboard, can make you overshoot the gear, and you go into gear 3 because your brain is again pushing on this metaphorical pedal and really revving your engine to cope.
Thank you for that. That's really interesting. You know, my partner, he cannot multitask at all, and I'm constantly juggling a lot of things. So interesting. So we have another question. Any tips for someone dealing with ADHD and or ADD?
Yes. So there is, so much data on ADD now that and people have some amazing ways of being able to cope and really do amazing things in the world. And I describe in the book how some of the highest achievers in the world actually have ADD and or ADHD, and they have learned how to kind of modulate their attention. So, one way of looking at it, and one line of research points to this, is that if you can control your gear, you can put yourself in the right mental space for optimal focus far better than your peers who don't have ADHD. So, one way to do that is it's possible that you need more stimulation and you need a bigger bandwidth of mental load. So multitasking is one thing, um, creating sort of interest in what you're doing, and also gravitating towards whatever it is you personally find interesting, because what you find interesting will inevitably nudge you into the optimal gear 2 state. So that's the ideal situation. Failing that, there are a couple of things you can do. You're trying to get into gear 2. So one way of doing it is exercise. Anything that makes your mind more alert and also slightly tired, but also more alert, will help push you into gear 2. So exercising immediately before you have to sit down and focus on something that you really don't fancy doing, that's a great way of doing it. Exercising before has been shown to improve performance in people with ADHD. And in addition to exercising before, using little tips and strategies for guiding your focus. So, for instance, post-it notes about telling you when to plan, telling you what to do, what to keep your attention on. Those nudges can also help. But in an ideal world, what you want to do is you want to find whatever it is, even if it's something very small and very superficial in your environment that interests you, and you want to anchor onto that and use that to draw yourself into this optimal gear 2 state.
That's great. Thank you. So another question, and this is kind of an interesting comment. I've been kind of noodling on this. And so I'm unable to work in blocks of 90 minutes or even 60 minutes. So what would you recommend?
So if you can't work in blocks of 90 or 60, so may I ask, is this a question from our listeners? May I ask,
Yes.
is it because you don't prefer it, or is it because your work doesn't allow it? Would you be able to
Oh,
clarify that?
yeah, we'll come back to that, and hopefully she's still
Okay,
here.
because the
So
answers are going
another
to be very different.
Yes, okay, so that's good to know. So Dawn said, we used to have a 20-minute post-lunch walk allocated at work. We used to, sadly. I really felt better after a short walk outside. However, my need to eat is often greater. I mean, I find that, a walk is so much better than like diving into food, which is easy to do when you're at home or at work many times. But what other tips do you have that you would like to leave people here today as, just tools in their toolbox?
So I would actually use the tool of walking. So if you are ever in a situation where you have a mental block, either because you're creative or because you are at work, you have a problem you have to solve, or even because you have to sit down and write an email or write a report or create a presentation and you just have a mental block, go for a walk, take a walk. And give yourself, and I can push that further and say, if you ever find yourself sitting there staring at this wall for 10 minutes, give yourself a 10-minute rule. Get up, take a walk, even if it's a 15-minute walk, 10-minute walk. As soon as you come back after the walk, you may not have the solution, but the problem will look different. You will suddenly find new avenues around it.
Okay. So going back to that question, due to the monkey mind or lack of sustained attention, most I can do for schoolwork, for example, is 30 minutes, which is kind of what you're saying, is that you have the different modes of 1 and 3 where you want to stay in that, tune mode for most of the time. Like that's 30 to 40 minutes. So what would you recommend?
So this is actually a very classic example of you are in gear two, but then your mind, as soon as your mind is slightly tired, you're quickly drifting down into gear one. So for you, your attention is not varying. You can't, it's because of the work you're doing, you're not staying in gear two for that entire time, which is perfectly fine. Even if people don't have this tendency to not work in 90-minute cycles, and even if people kind of do really tough work or work that they personally find boring or laborious, for many people, you can't sustain your attention beyond 20 minutes. So every 20 to 30 minutes, take a break. If you don't want to lose the momentum of what you are doing, so if you have something on your mind and you think, oh, if I take a break now, it'll really interrupt my thoughts, don't worry. Keep your break to within 10 minutes. So every 20 minutes, go take a break. The break can last 3 to 10 minutes, and then you don't have to work in 90-minute cycles. But after around about 90 minutes, give yourself a longer break.
That's terrific advice. Thank you. What else would you like to leave people with today?
I think another concept I'd love everyone to embrace is the idea of trying to find something in your work and in your life which will sustain your work, where you continuously grow, you continuously improve through learning, whether it's learning a skill,
Mhm.
whether it's just improving in some dimension, because this sense of continuous improvement along a narrative, along a progressive narrative, where you never reach the finish line, but you're always improving as fast as possible. If you can put yourself into that state, either once a week, ideally once a day, in a dream situation every day, then that puts you into an optimal mental state to be able to do any kind of work. So, crafting your life, crafting your work in a way that your skills are just perfectly stretched. You're challenged right to the limit of your skills and you're extremely engaged and you're expanding those skills continuously. That's a great state to be in.
Well, I'm going to leave it at that comment because I think that's so important for us to continually learn and to stretch ourselves and to be curious about life and our work and our creativity is just really the zest of life and makes our work so much easier and better when we do this. The book is called Hyperefficient: Optimize Your Brain to Transform the Way You Work. And I want to thank you so much for being here today. It's a fabulous book. There's so much more in it than we talked about today. And I highly encourage you to read it. And thank you so much for joining us from England today. It's pretty late there. It's almost 10, I think, right?
Well, it's a pleasure to join you. It's a pleasure to join you. And
Thank
I'm
you
just
so
imagining
much.
all the sunshine weather that you're having over there and trying to draw some our way. But thank you
Well,
so
thank
much for
you.
having me. It's been a real
Thank you.
pleasure.
A real pleasure as well. Thank you.